Brought to you by Connect.js, Atlanta's premier JavaScript conference. Sponsored in part by FeatherDirect. Need a mobile app? Contact us for your custom mobile solution.
Hi everyone, my name is Jason-Reece and I'm a front-end web developer at Big Nerd Ranch here in Atlanta. And I want to talk today about CSS organization. I think that CSS is often a bit of an afterthought for a lot of developers. And I think this is for good reason. For one, CSS is easy, right? It's a relatively easy to learn language. It's got a simple syntax. Basically, we're selecting things from the DOM and then making changes to them by adding property value pairs, right? So here we're selecting the body and then we're changing the background to this hex here. And let me bump up just a little bit and see if we can get away with it. Nope, that doesn't do anything. All right. So the thing with CSS is it's also a little bit sneaky. As your project starts to scale, making changes to your code becomes more and more difficult. And you find yourself needing to become increasingly specific to make your changes. And then you would like to go in and refactor, but that's a little bit scary because CSS doesn't have any scope. So everything is in a global namespace. So when you try to refactor, you're not sure exactly what you're going to break. So you end up doing things like this snippet of code here. You come up with a really specific selector. If necessary, you add an important tag, and you just take the CSS that you've written and you stick this on the bottom, right? And then over time, you end up with almost as much stuff down at the bottom as you started with at the top, right? So I want to move away from this pattern of writing CSS and move towards architecting CSS. And in order to architect CSS, we're going to need to become a little bit OCD. And by OCD, I do mean crazy. But I also mean that we need to be organized, we need to be componentized, and we need to be decoupled. So we need to have an organization system in place, right? For the way that we're arranging our files, and also for the way that we're namespacing. We need to be creating these reusable components across the site, and these components need to be decoupled from each other and from many parent containers. So the question is, how OCD do we need to be? So I have a list of questions to sort of help you determine if you need to be more or less OCD. First, should you be more OCD? So are you using a preprocessor? So quick show of hands, how many people in here are using a preprocessor for their styles? Cool. And of those people, how many are using Sass? Cool. And then what about less? Good. And is anyone using stylus or anything else? Very quiet. And the next question is, are you following a style guide? So the goal here is, if we have 4 developers working on a project, ideally, we want the code base to look as if it was written by one person. So things like consistent white space, a consistent name spacing. We don't want developers reinventing the same module, right? We want to make sure we're using consistent things. And there's a movement for in the front end where people are creating with living style guides. So literally a place that holds all of your base styles and then all of your modules. And there's a very good tool that can automate this for you called Hologram that was created by the Trulia team. Definitely take a look at that. The next question is, do you have a scalable convention for naming things, right? So if we namespace things properly, it allows us to refactor and improve our code. Another huge one is, are you paying attention to the final output of your CSS? With preprocessors like Sass, you can do some really amazing things that will output a ton of code. But if you aren't careful, you can also do some crazy things that will mess up your performance and cause all kinds of issues. So the best tool I've found for this is at sassmeister.com. I use Sassmeister quite a bit. Anytime I'm creating a new module or maybe doing something with a loop or extending something, I want to make sure that my output is clean. So I will write my Sass in Sassmeister, make sure the output looks good, and then bring it into my project. And then finally, are you using CSS lint? I think that linting is pretty big in the JavaScript community, and I think it would be really great. I think there's a huge advantage to doing that in your CSS as well. So on the other hand, should you be less OCD? Are the other developers on your team going to be willing to follow your conventions? So I'll give you an example of this. Personally, when I write CSS, I alphabetize all of my declarations. But I think that asking anyone else to do this would probably be pretty annoying. But the good news is, for people like me, there is a tool that you can use that will, in your build process, that will do a lot of this for you. It's called CSS Comb. So you run that as part of your build, and it organizes, takes care of white space, those kinds of things for you. The next question is your code easily understood by other developers? And then also, are you going to understand it 2 months from now? So I saw an article a couple months back titled, "Are We Getting Too Sassy?" And it highlighted a very clean, very dry button mix-in that produced really great code. But the problem was, in order to understand what was happening, you really needed to spend 5 or 10 minutes to kind of figure out what Sass was actually doing. And I think that that's too much to ask for a new developer coming into your project for just a few weeks. And you can imagine if there are mix-ins with that level of complexity across the site, it's a pretty steep ramp up for new developers and for you if you've been away for a while. Right? So that should give you sort of an idea of where you are on the OCD meter. I want to make just a quick disclaimer. I'm absolutely not prescribing the one true way to write scalable code. Obviously, there are tons of ways to approach this. I'm just hoping that there's something here for everyone. And if you have something that's working for you, be it a tool or a pattern that you're using, please share it. And, I always love learning new things. So I want to talk about some of the different ways that we can architect our CSS. So the first approach is architecting with OOCSS. It stands for Object-Oriented CSS. It's a project created by Nicole Sullivan. And there's 2 main points. First, she suggests that you separate your layout code from your skin code. So layout code is code that affects the box model, right? So it's things like your height and your width and your paddings and your margins. And then your skin code is going to be things like background colors, gradients, things that really make visual changes. The other point is to separate the content from the container, right? So we want to build things in these reusable modules, and we don't want those modules to be dependent on any parents. So we want them to be decoupled, right? So that's a very high-level look at OOCSS. And I also want to look at a project called SMACSS. SMACSS stands for Scalable and Modular Architecture for CSS. It's a book written by Jonathan Snook, and I think it's a must-read for anyone that's writing CSS. Some really great stuff in here. At a high level, here are the two main points that I got out of the book. Basically, you want to break your CSS rule sets into 5 categories. You have base, layout, module, state, and theme. And the good news is, out of these 5 categories, most of the time you're going to be using the first 3, base, layout, and module. Right? And we'll go a little deeper into what each of these things is in just a second. But the other major point I wanted to cover is SMACSS suggests that you minimize the depth of your selectors. So what this results in is a much more shallow specificity in your CSS. So we're not dependent on a specific HTML structure. So again, we're being decoupled from needing any structures. So let's look at some of the pieces with SMACSS. First, there are base rules, and these are just going to be your project defaults. So these go directly on the elements themselves, so no class names. And it's everything that you want that element to inherit by default. So every H2 in our project, we want to have a font size of 30 and a line height of 45. Every anchor tag, we want to have this beautiful color blue. All right, so that's base rules. Let's look at layout. Layout breaks your page into pieces, right? So when you write your layout code, SMACSS suggests that you prefix this with an L dash or a layout dash. So you can think about you're building things in modules, and the layout is the thing that stitches those modules together, right? And then we have SMACSS module rules. These are the reusable Lego pieces, right? They're going to sit inside of our layout code. And these should be prefixed with the module name itself. So here I've got some callout code, and inside of that callout there is a callout link that's changing the color, right? So these are the main 3 rules that we're going to use. But you'll also find yourself using state rules. So this describes how a layout or a module could look in a particular state. And it's typically something that's applied via JavaScript, right? So SMACSS suggests that you prefix this with an is dash whatever. So in this case, we've got a callout that is collapsed, and if that state is applied, we want to set the max height to 0. And then finally, there are SMACSS theme rules. And themes describe how a module could look. Honestly, I've never actually used these in a site, but an example of this is if you look at when you're customizing your Twitter page, you have 5 or 6 different colors you can choose from, or you can pass in a hex, right? And that applies a new theme to the site. So that's just kind of a look at some organizational patterns. I want to talk for a little bit about architecting with Sass. I love Sass. I think that Sass gives your CSS superpowers. And like all superpowers, they can be used for good or for evil, right? So I want to show some good and bad use cases for writing Sass. Before we go into that, just for anyone that hasn't used Sass yet, just how to get it up and running. To set it up on your machine, Sass is a Ruby gem, so you will just run gem install Sass on your command line, and then you need to compile your Sass. So you're writing Sass code that you need to be compiled into CSS code. So the way that you can do that, there's a number of build tools that will help with this. You have grunt and gulp. There are also applications that you can use like CodeKit or Mixture. But you can actually just do it directly from your command line. You just run sass watch, the path to your input Sass file, colon, your output CSS file. All right, so here's an example of bad nesting in Sass. Nesting, when you first start using Sass, nesting feels so good, right? Like you can literally match your HTML structure with your CSS and it's organized, it just feels right. But it's actually really bad because it increases your specificity unnecessarily. So if you look here, I've got a nav, a UL, LI, and an A. And it's, that's a pattern that we use quite a bit. But since we have it nested, our outputted CSS, we get this additional specificity on our selector, nav, UL, LI, right? When really we just need to target the LI. But I think there's a rule in the industry called the inception rule. And they say that you should never go more than 3 levels deep, right? But I want to make the argument that really you should never go deeper than you need to. So I'll give you an example of a good reason or a good use of nesting. When you need to target pseudo selectors like first child, last child, this is specificity that you absolutely have to have. So nesting it makes sense, right? So another thing that you get with Sass is you get to use variables. And a pattern that we see a lot is people will namespace their variables in a way that makes sense to them. So I have this hex here set to color yellow, color orange, color green. But you can actually make those things more scalable by then resetting those variables to more scalable names like color primary, color secondary. And the nice thing about variables is none of this gets outputted as CSS. So you can reset a variable to a variable as much as you need to, right? And as of Sass 3.3, we actually have Sass maps, which are variables with key value pairs, right? So this has been out for just about a year now. So here, I'm kind of doing the exact same thing. I've got a map of human readable colors, right? I've got our color yellow, orange, and green. And then I've got a second map of project scalable colors. And what we're doing is we're setting color primary to the value of a built-in Sass function called mapGet. And mapGet takes in 2 arguments. It takes in the name of the map that you want to get, and it takes in the key that you want to get out of it, right? So in this case, we want to take in the human readable colors and get the color yellow, right? And so forth. So then the way that we would use this is we would target this color primary, we run a mapGet on project scalable and get color primary. So that's going to look at color primary, run a mapGet on human readable, and get the color yellow up here. So this ends up being our outputted CSS, right? All right, so that's just a quick high-level look at maps. I want to look at mixins. I think this is probably one of the most used tools in Sass and one of the probably most abused. So first, I want to give an example of a good use for a mixin. And this is a rim sizing mixin. And for those who don't know, rim is a unit in which you can size things. It stands for root M. And the issue is older browsers don't support rim, so we need to have that browser fall back to a pixel. So in this mixin, the way you create a mixin for anyone new is you use the @mixin keyword. You give it a name, in this case rim sizing, and you have the option to give it some arguments. Here we're passing in the property that we want to use and a size, right? So each time, for each of these declarations, first we're going to do pixels. So we're going to take the size and multiply it by 10 pixels. The second time, we're going to take the size and multiply it by 1 rem. There's a line here that I use in every project. This is just for my own sanity, to keep me from doing unnecessary math. I set my font size on the HTML to 62.5. This gives me some intuitive font sizes. So 10 pixels is now equal to 1 rem. So if I need to create something that's 16 pixels, that's 1.6 rem, right? Like I can do that in my head. And in Sass, the way that you use your mixin is you say @include, the name of your mixin, and then the arguments that you need. So first we're going to call font size, and we're going to pass in 3 rems, right? So what gets outputted is a font size of 30 pixels, and then a font size of 3 rem. And so in an older browser like IE8, you get an error on this line, so it falls back to 30 pixels, right? And we did the same thing for line height of 45. Okay, so the key to this mixin is that everything that it's doing is very dynamic, right? There's not a lot of static content. I want to give you another good use case for a mixin. And that's when you're using this @content block here. So what this is doing is we're creating a responsive breakpoint mixin. So what we're going to do is we're going to nest all of our media queries in our rule set. So we don't need to have separate style sheets for media queries. It's all going to be in one file. So we've got a mixin called breakpoint, and it takes in our width. And then we're going to have our media query, and it's going to be a mobile first media query. So it's a min width of width, whatever width we're passing in. And if you'd like, you could have a map of your breakpoints and then run a map get on the width that you want to get, like a width of tablet, something like that. And then the key thing is this @content block here. So when we call our mixin, we're going to have open and close curly braces, and all the declarations that are inside of that mixin are going to get passed in through this @content block. So here's an example of using it. We've got our layout container, and from size 0 to 767, we want the width to be 90%. And then once we hit our breakpoint of 768, we want to set the width to 50%, right? And we could have as many declarations here as we would like, and it all gets spit out in this content block. So here's the outputted CSS. First we have our layout container, then we have our media query with our layout container, right? One more quick use of content block. We have this mixin called attention. And so whenever you're styling a hover state, it's recommended that you also style an active and a focus state for accessibility, for people using screen readers and things like that. But typing that comma-separated list gets old pretty quick. So this is something that I stole from Harry Roberts from CSS Wizardry. It's this mixin, he calls it attention. And so anytime you want this comma-separated list, you create this mixin, and then you just call the mixin in your code and pass in any declarations you want. So here we've got our attention, and we're outputting this comma-separated list and setting the color to blue, right? So that's all good use of mixin. So everything that we've used the mixin for has been very dynamic. So here's what happens when you try to pass in static stuff. So we've got a mixin called center, and it has 3 static declarations. We're going to set the element to display block, set the margin left and right to auto, right? So when we include this mixin, we don't even need to put any arguments in. We just include center. But if you look at the output, now we have container 1 and container 2 with the exact same output. So you can imagine if you're putting static mix-ins all across your site, how much additional bloated CSS you end up with, right? And there are actually some pretty popular grid systems that take this approach. So, careful of that. So what can we do to dry this up a little bit? We can take a look at Sass extends. Now, actually, before I even go into this, I want to say, when you start researching Sass extends, you're going to find a lot of people giving warnings about using them. And I think that's for good reason. They can also produce some surprising output, especially when you're nesting them. And when you're using this dot syntax here. So what I have is I have a class of center, and I've got these 3 static rules. The way that I'm extending them is I'm using this dot center syntax and saying, give me all this code. So now we're a little bit better than the mix-in because we have a comma-separated list of all the shared styles. And then we have our independent styles in separate rule sets, right? So this is a little bit better. But we're never actually going to put this center class in our markup. So what can we do to have a cleaner output that's less likely to surprise us? That is where Sass placeholder extends come in. So instead of using the dot syntax, we're now using this kind of ugly placeholder syntax using these percent signs. So we go percent center, and when we extend them, we extend percent center. And now our output is exactly what we would expect. Comma-separated list of the shared styles, separate rule sets for the different styles, right? So that's a look at using placeholders. We're going to see a lot more of them as the talk goes on. Also, there are Sass functions. And we've already seen some of the built-in functions like map get for getting things out of maps. There are also color functions, like you can run a lighten or a darken on your code. So there's a lot of built-in Sass functions, but you can actually create your own as well. So you use the @function keyword, you give it a name, or in this case I'm calling it RW, and this is a function to use the responsive width formula from Ethan Marcotte's responsive web design book. And that formula is target divided by context, and then taking the result of that and target divided by context, taking the result of that, multiplying it by 100%. So our function is going to take in 2 arguments, the target and the context. And we're going to run the math, return the result of the math here. So the way that you use it is on your element, you're setting a width of the result of RW. You're calling RW with 720 for your target, 960 for your context. And that returns 75% in your output. And then for the second container, we're doing 240 and 960. That's going to give us 25%. So this is kind of like a main content thing with a sidebar on the side. Here's a slightly more advanced function. So what we're doing here, I think that the map get syntax is a bit ugly. So you can actually take a map of colors, create a function, give it a name, in this case, name color. It's going to take in a key. And there's another built-in Sass function called map has key. It takes in a map, and it takes in a key from the map. And if that key exists, it returns true, otherwise false. So in this case, we're going to say if the map has the key, we're going to pass in our colors map and the key. And if that key exists, we're going to run a map get on it. Otherwise, we're going to say, hey, you don't have this key in this map, and just exit out of the function, right? So the way that we would use this is just like we use the other built-in functions. On this div, we're setting a background to the color function and the key of blue. And that's going to give us this hex here from this, right? So that's just a kind of a shorthand way of using map get without having to type out that whole syntax. This was also stolen from Hugo. So I want to talk for a little bit about using loops in Sass. You can do some really cool stuff with loops. So here I've got an example of a for loop. What we're doing is we're looping from 1 to 12, and each time we go through the loop, we're going to create a silent placeholder extend. And we're going to call that layout grid 1. Next time, layout grid 2, layout grid 3, every time we go through the loop. And then also, each time we go through the loop, we're going to run some math to create the width. So we're going to divide by 12 and then multiply the result of that by 100%, right? So the way that we would use this is on one container, we would say extend this silent placeholder lgrid 9. That's going to result in 75%. And then for our right container, lgrid 3. Give me 3 of the 12 columns. So that's going to result in 25%. All right? So really quick and simple grid system, but you can do a ton of things with loops. Here's an example of a while loop, and we're basically doing the exact same thing here, just with a different syntax. We're creating a variable as a counter here at 12. Each time we go through the loop, we are running the same, creating the same grid, and then we are subtracting the value of our counter by 1, right? So this returns the exact same output. And the nice thing is, the point that I want to make is we're actually creating 12 silent things, so nothing actually gets outputted in our CSS. And then finally, there are each loops. And this is the type of loop that I find myself using the most. It enables you to easily loop over maps. So here I've got the color map again. And we're going to loop over each key and value in the map. So each color name and hex, right? And each time we go through, we're going to create this rule set. We've got a T dash, which in my naming convention, that stands for typography dash. And then we're going to pass in the key as the color name, and we're going to set the color to the hex value. So we're outputting T color primary with a hex, color secondary with a hex, and so on. So, and here's a more advanced each loop. For anyone familiar with Paul Irish's bulletproof at font face, this snippet of code here should look fairly familiar, right? And so you end up typing something like this for every font weight in your project. And that is kind of terrible. So what we're doing here is instead, typically the designer gives you a few different font families with a handful of weights for each family. So we've got a map of all of our fonts. We've got our font families. In this case, we just have 2. And then we have our font weights. So we have a total of 4. So what we're going to do is we're going to loop through each font group and then loop through each font weight, right? And then what we're outputting is the final bulletproof at font face here, right? So in any new project, the only things that I need to update the names of my fonts, and I need to just make sure that the path to the font folders are correct. And so I use this in every project, right? So that's just, kind of a quick look at some of the tools in Sass and how you can best use those to architect your stuff. I want to talk for a little bit about CSS-burrito. This is an open source project that I have authored, and it's a starting Sass template for any project, right? So here's a look at the file structure. So we start with the style sheets folder. Inside of that, we have 3 folders. We have our core styles. We have our libs, which is any third-party code. And then we have our modules, which starts off empty. It just has a modules.scss file that's going to import in all of our modules for us. So it's going to start out empty, and hopefully it's going to eventually hold the majority of your code for the project. And then finally, we have this application.css.scss file. And that's just a Rails naming convention. This is going to be the one file that rules them all. So this is going to import in all of our core and all of our libraries, right? So let's take a look at what's in this file. So we start off importing our libraries. So you get normalized by default, which is a reset to make the browsers look consistent. The most important thing in this file is this library variable overrides file. So what this does is, say you're bringing in third-party code, something like, God forbid, Bootstrap or Foundation or whatever you're using. Those projects come with a number of variables, like link color is an example in Bootstrap. And you always want to tweak these and override these. So what you can do is make the change here in this library variable overrides file, which is not that easy to say. You'll make those changes there. And that way, if you ever need to update your third-party code, you can. But also, in the way that Sass handles variables, it's going to take the first instance of the variable. So you set it here, it actually doesn't get overridden when you bring Bootstrap in below, right? So that's our library. Then we have our core, right? And that's going to bring in all of our files, and then bring in our modules, and I'll go into what each of these files does. Finally, we have our inbox. And the inbox is, let's say I'm the maintainer of a project, and then I have another developer that's coming onto the project for just a few weeks just to knock out a couple of features, right? So they may not have time to completely understand the entire code base. So what they're going to do is maybe they need to write a little bit of CSS just to get things going. So they're going to write their CSS here in the inbox, and then the maintainer of the file is actually going to come in, refactor, and correctly place all of this code and organize it. And then finally, this has a shame section. And this is another thing borrowed from Harry Roberts. So, if you have a build that you need to get out that day, if you have quick fixes, hacks, or questionable techniques, add them in here and then go back and fix them later, right? So let's look at some of these files in the core. The first thing that we pull in is our settings file. And this is where we're going to keep all of our variables. Actually, the first thing that we bring in is that @fontface loop, right? Because later in this file, we're probably going to want to set variables for our font stack, right? So we set up our @fontface, then we set our variables for color, type, grid, whatever you need. It's going to be in here. After settings, we're going to bring in our utilities. These are our placeholder extends. For example, maybe you want to use a clear fix. We have our mix-ins after that, and these are some of the mix-ins we've seen in this talk, like the breakpoint mix-in, the attention mix-in, and the rim sizing mix-in. Any functions that you want to use in your project. And then finally, any utility classes. So these are classes that you do want to put in your markup. And the way that I namespace these is I prefix them with a U for utility. So U pull left, setting a float left. All right, so that's utilities. Now we have some things that we've seen before from SMACSS, for example. So then we have our base styles. And by default, it's commented out, but I do keep the HTML font size 62.5% in case you do want to use rim sizing. So that's the base. Then we have our global layout styles. And these, like SMACSS suggests, we prefix with an L dash. And then we have our global skin that are prefixed with an S dash. So looking back at OOCSS, we're separating our layout from our skin. But we actually take it one step further and we separate layout, skin, and typography. So all of our global typography styles are going to be prefixed with a T. Right? So then what do we do with our modules? If you think about it, you have your global layout styles, skin styles, and type styles, but inside of your modules, there's often quite a bit of tweaks for layouts, skins, and type, right? So the way that we namespace these, we break them further down into their own layout, skins, and typography, and namespace them like this. The name of the module -L, the name of the module -S, -T, is whatever. So here's a look at a sample module file. We've got our widget module. This is for all of our widget code. And first thing you'll notice is this giant ASCII art here. This is there because I use Sublime Text as my editor, and it has the nice sidebar. So as I'm scrubbing up and down in this file, I like having this giant ASCII so I can just quickly kind of find where I need to be. I know it's honestly, I kind of feel like I need to take this project and give you an option of not having these comments, but I'm a sucker for ASCII art. So here's an example of a layout selector. We've got our widget layout container with some layout code. For our skin, we've got our widget skin primary, setting the background to a map get on the colors map and getting the color primary. For our type, we're using our rim sizing mix-in, getting the font size and setting it to 4 rim, right? And it's a widget T heading. Then you'll notice there's something called components that we'll talk about in just a second. Finally, there are states. And in this case, if our widget is closed, we want to set the max height to 0. And you'll notice that my state class does have this additional specificity. We've actually got a weight of 2 classes on this. And you want your state classes to always be the most specific thing in your module, so that when it gets applied via JavaScript, you want to make sure that that's running. All right, so what are these components all about? So if you're going to break your module styles up into layout, skin, and type, you're also going to find yourself needing 3 classes a lot of time in your markup, right? So now you're adding a layout class, a skin class, and a type class. So what we do in this case is we use what I call a component. So instead, we're going to have one class prefixed with the name of the module -C, and we're going to use silent placeholder extends to actually build this component. So here's what that looks like. We have our sample widget component. So we have a placeholder for our layout code, for our skin code, and for our type code, right? And then this is what goes in the markup, this component selector. And all that's going to be in here is all of our extends. So we're going to be extending the layout, skin, and typography styles here. And you may not need all 3. Obviously, you can delete the type styles if you need to and just pull it out at both places. So this seems to work really well. But I imagine one thing that you could be thinking is, man, that looks like a lot of typing, right? Typing that every time with the placeholders and everything. So that is where CSS-burrito comes to the rescue. It is a global NPM module that you can use, and it will do 3 actions for you. So you can create a new instance of a project by running burrito-new in the command line. It will also create new module files for you, and it will actually import that file into the modules, the main modules partial for you as well. So you literally run the burrito and the module name, and then you can just open up the file that you created and start coding, and everything's just wired up. And then finally, when we want to create this snippet of code here, we can use this burrito-c command, and it takes in 2 arguments: the name of your module, and then a descriptive name for the text. And what it does, it generates a snippet for you in the command line. You just look at it, and if it looks right, you can just tab over to your editor and just hit paste. It's already copied to your clipboard. So, enough talking, and let's see a demo of this. What could go wrong when live coding? So I'm going to go to my desktop, and I'm going to make a folder called Connect.js. I'm going to go into it. All right, so now I'm just going to run burrito new. And boom. And we have successfully added it into our project. So I'm going to open this up in Sublime. My apologies, I know this sidebar is relatively small. But we've got our style sheets with our core, libs, and modules, right? And right now, our modules file, it just has this example module here that's just here to give you an idea of how this would work. And you might be able to see the sidebar up there. That's why I have my ASCII art. So let's add in a couple of modules. Let's say so the first thing we need to do is go into our modules directory. And we're going to say burrito, let's add a buttons module. Cool. You have created a new file named buttons, and it's been imported into the modules file for us. And we'll also make a what module? A widgets module. Oh, not button, but burrito. Live coding. So now, if you look in our modules file, we've got our buttons and our widgets imported in for us. We've got these modules here. Let's get rid of this. We've got these modules here and ready to write code in, right? So finally, let's create the component pattern. So we have, you do burrito-c, the name of your module. So we'll say buttons, and then the third argument is going to be a descriptive name. So we'll just say primary, right? So you hit enter. Now we get this snippet, right? It's got a comment, it's got our layout, skin, type, and that all looks good. So I'm just going to tab over, go to my component section, and hit paste, right? So now I can jump up, start adding my layout code, my skin code, and my type, right? So that is my quick demo. I have one more piece of news. So as of yesterday, for anyone that's interested in learning more about Sass or teaching Sass or just talking about Sass, we're going to be starting a Sass meetup. First meeting is in 6 weeks, so it's December 2nd, 6:30 at Big Nerd Ranch, who has been kind enough to sponsor the meetup. It's a link to the meetup here. The Twitter handle is ATLSass. If you're interested, please follow. I just set it up last night, so it's lonely. So yeah, if you're interested, let us know. If you want to speak, want to sponsor, any of that kind of stuff, please just let us know. And thank you very much. That's all I've got. So I guess we have about 10 minutes or so. This talk was only supposed to be 30 minutes, but we've got about 10 minutes till the break. If anyone has questions, I'm feeling brave enough to try to answer them. Oh, great. Yes.
I didn't have one question. So why SCSS instead of SAS syntax in your burrito project?
Okay. So one of my points was making sure that it's easy for other developers. And I think that the syntax, the .sass syntax is pretty sexy, but it also lends itself more to errors, especially if you've used maps with the .sass syntax. Have you looked at that yet? It gets really confusing. You know, when you start having nested maps and things like that, it's really hard to know what's happening without all the commas and the additional syntax. So SCSS, I think, is the fastest way for a developer to come into a project, and maybe if they've been using less or something like that, they're ready to go. How do you get a large team on the same page? Fear. No, I'm just kidding. One tool that you can use to kind of strictly enforce things is a project called editor config. So with editor config, it has plugins for most IDEs, and you can enforce things like white space strictly, right? And you can use it for any files, star.scss, star.javascript, whatever it is. So I think that's one way. The other way is by controlling your build. So if there are things that you want namespaced a specific way, you can use tools like CSS Comb to try to control a little bit of that. And then also, I think some of the best things that you can do are around pairing with other developers and lunch and learns and those kinds of things, like really promoting a culture of you don't have to know everything. Like, let's talk and figure out what the best patterns are, right?
Yeah, because right now our CSS is a bit messy, but there's so many people adding so many times that the first slide will go
Yeah. I'm gonna have bad dreams. Yes.
Yeah. So I noticed that you may not be the biggest fan of Twitter Bootstrap. Could you maybe talk about alternatives or what you don't like about Bootstrap?
Well, so here's what I don't like about Bootstrap. I think it really, if you're going to use Bootstrap, you need to, or Foundation, or Yahoo's Pure, or any of these frameworks, then you really need your design team and the client to be on board with the forms that are in this, with all the components that are built into the system. Because I don't like the idea of give me this massive dump of CSS, and then maybe you have normalize or some kind of reset. Then you have Bootstrap, and now I'm gonna start writing my code and have to override all of these other layers, right? So if you are going to be using something like Bootstrap or Foundation, ideally the designers will design with that in mind. So maybe you're tweaking variables and that kind of thing to get your look. But hopefully you're not starting with Bootstrap and then reinventing the wheel. Right. Right. Yeah, you can. You have that nice variables override. You can just import what you want. Yeah. I'm not a Bootstrap hater. I just I think the key thing is if you're using this third-party code, collaborate with your designers so that they will sort of start with that as their paradigm, right? You don't want to take the modules from Bootstrap or Foundation and then reinvent them. So love your designers. Yes?
Second question. When it comes to is there any kind of framework that provides
Honestly, I have stayed away from Flexbox at this point because I haven't had a client that would say I only want to support IE10, and I haven't really looked at how good the polyfills are. So I've kind of just been looking at Flexbox like a toy to play with in the future, and I'm not really sure. I'm probably not the best versed for that tool. But I did know that I was going to get a Flexbox question, so I think that's a good sign. I feel like it's right on the edge of being something that we can play with.
So sort of building on their questions, he asked what alternatives we have besides Foundation, but the one Bootstrap.
So what besides Foundation and Bootstrap? I may be the wrong guy for this question. I've looked at Yahoo's Pure, which looks pretty small. In terms of grid systems, I'll say that I really like Suzy and I really like Bourbon Neat, right? But the problem with those is they use mix-ins that are repeating this dump of kind of static text each time you use them. So what I do is I use the for loop pattern and actually call the mix-in 12 times or whatever, and then extend those so that I'm not, if that makes sense, so that I'm not repeating this mix-in every time. I'm extending an instance of the mix-in multiple times, so it only gets called once. I hope that made sense. Yes?
So, with everything you kind of taught us today, do you think, is it like easier to go about creating a system that works for you as opposed to trying to create a framework using like an css-burrito and all these things? So can you get like a base, like skeleton thing going quick enough?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, part of that comes with collaborating well with designers. So one thing that we do when I get to work with in-house designers is we actually pair, and we use a living style guide so that all of the modules are right there in your face, and you can sit down with the designer and say, well, we already have this, how do we want to reuse this? So it enables us to have a strong base, because I literally, I'm getting a chance to sit with a designer and say, okay, let's figure out what is a line height that makes sense. And so now I'm able to create a base that's going to inherit this font size, this line height, right? Which I guess is sort of what Bootstrap is doing anyway. It's giving you some default typography, line height, that kind of stuff. I swear I'm not a Bootstrap hater. All right. Please come to the meetup. And also, did you have a question back there?
Yes, are you going to make the slides available?
Yes, I will tweet out the slides in the next few minutes. I'm jason_reece on Twitter. Please come to the SASS meetup if you want to learn more. And also, if you want to learn more about Big Nerd Ranch, they have propaganda on the table here, including nerd glasses and beer koozies that are cowboy boots. All right, thank you all.